I think that's a good way of describing it. Not all utopia, not all fighting, a mix therein. Utopia with fighting. So I came to this because I lived in a squat, and I, as a teenager, coming up through the anarcho-punk scene on the East Coast, was in squatted spaces all the time for shows where friends were living. But when I started living in a squat in the Bronx, the people who were living there never called it a squat, they called it a homestead. And I started calling it a homestead, and I started wondering, what is this thing homesteading? And so tonight I'm going to talk about the history of squatting and homesteading on the Lower East Side in particular, and also in a broader context, and try to sort of break down the dichotomy between the two. And this is part of what's in Ours to Lose, if anyone's interested in learning more. So can I just get a sort of a sense of people who are in the room? Who's been involved with squatting in this room? Come on, hands for real. Homesteading?
Squatting. Across the street, 2 buildings. The big brick building, that's Waco's, and then down the street, Serenity.
All right, if you go to you're going to see pictures of both of them as this plays all the way through. And so what do you guys think of when you think of squatting? Just throw out some words, some ideas. Free association.
Occupy.
Occupy?
Yeah.
Hold out.
Hold up?
Community.
Community?
You want a definition from a former squatter?
No, just some words. Okay, I'll take a definition.
Taking over abandoned building that otherwise the real estate maggots would grab hold of and turn it into condos. As they did the building across the street. So we don't pay rent. We had rules like no stealing, no hard drugs, no violence. We tried to respect each other, and we didn't pay rent, and we concentrated on fixing up the building, making it livable. That's what squatting is.
That's a great way of explaining it. Sorry, I'm just going to get that PowerPoint up here so I can show you some more images. Making it livable. What do people think of when you think about homesteading?
Sweat equity.
Sweat equity? What's sweat equity?
Equity without that is not money based. That is based on other kinds of values, like your effort.
Right. So building equity, building rights in something through working on it, through your own sweat, your own labor. And that's an idea that's familiar to a lot of us, right? It's actually an idea that's part of sort of liberal capitalist ideology. John Locke said that we make things our own when we mix our labor with them, right? That we own ourselves. When we mix our labor with other things, they become sort of part of our orbit. So it's an idea that has a lot of different possible ideological valences. A few more, yeah?
I think most people tend to think of homesteading. The squatters call themselves homesteaders because it's more palatable. People don't freak out when they hear the term squatter. Or whatever, they have other reasons, but one's legal, one's not.
It's a legalization.
Homesteading was a program that was sponsored by the feds and then the city, and people could join and become part of cleaning out the buildings. It was legal. Squatting is one of the things you have to watch out for. The police trying to take your house.
Right. And so that idea that homesteading is more palatable, I think is right. That if you sort of follow media images of squatters, especially in New York City, less so in other parts of the world, we see people who are angry, who are rioting in the street in this neighborhood, people who are white, who are not from here, are some of the sort of popular media images that you'll see. And so what I want to talk about today is how these two phenomena, these two movements have interacted over time. So homesteading has never existed without squatting, basically. The Homestead Act in America that was signed into law in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln came about through a debate that will be familiar to many of you over how the government should dispose of so-called empty land in the American West. Some people thought that it should be sold to speculators in large parcels, who could then break it up, sell it to other people, hold on to it and sell it later, use it for large endeavors. And some people thought that it should be given or sold to people who would actually use it at a scale at which they could use it. When empty land, so-called empty land, actually owned and often used by indigenous people, was given to speculators in big parcels, those parcels were indefensible. Squatters started living on them. Squatters who said there's no moral right to this land, even if it's been legally given to this person, they don't have the right to exclude us because they're not using it. They're not contributing to society with this land, right? And so squatters were so persistent, they were so undefeatable, that eventually the Homesteading Act was passed. And homesteading has been sort of a part of how land has been dispersed in America ever since then. Homesteading in Alaska lasted through the 1970s or 80s, right? And so when we talk about urban homesteading, we often see a similar kind of dynamic. Urban homesteading is a policy and a practice that has been in place all around the United States, mostly obviously in cities, urban. But the first trial sweat equity project actually happened here on the Lower East Side in 1867.
Would you repeat?
Trial sweat equity project. So, an attempt at seeing if people could take a building, fix it up, take care of it, build equity through their labor, and then actually get title to it. And that was not cleared with the city. No one went to the city and said, can we take this building and work on it? They just started working on it to try to get the title. And this continued, it built momentum. In 1969, in East Harlem, a Catholic priest led a group of people that took over, renovated, and eventually got title to 2 buildings. And this started getting into the news because there was a nationwide crisis in our cities. There was space and housing that was abandoned, that was decaying. No one seemed to know what to do. Capital was leaving the cities, and city governments weren't able to manage this problem. In New York City, the government started taking more and more and more buildings that people weren't paying taxes on or weren't taking care of, but they had no way to dispose of them or deal with them. And so similarly, so this is a story from 1970, similarly as in the American West, we see people starting to squat and the government responding with the offer of a homesteading program. And squatters sort of using this language of homesteading, which now is available as part of our cultural repertoire dating back to the 1800s, to say, well, we're not doing something bad and illegal. We're making a legitimate moral claim on this space because no one's using it, it's going to waste. And speculation on land and property is not right. It's right to use it and keep it vibrant. So in 1970, one of the first, in this era, major organized squatting campaigns happened on the Upper West Side. It was called Operation Move-In, and it was in response to so-called urban renewal in the Upper West Side. So there was a lot of housing that had been vacated in preparation for being demolished and replaced with new housing, but it was just sitting there empty, and there were a lot of people who needed housing. So people started organizing, taking it over, and they really built a lot of momentum. So this is April 1970. We start to see stories about it in the news. By July of 1970, we see squatter movement grows as housing protest tactic. And so the word here is squatter, right? But the media coverage is pretty favorable, right? We see images of needy families, people who are deserving. And this has been an issue that's come up for squatters over and over again, right? Like, who is deserving of this housing, who has the right to take it? And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. By October, squatters are actually challenging the very makeup of these urban renewal plans. Some of these campaigns were successful to the point that people were able to get title to the buildings they were holding, and use sweat equity to renovate them and come to own them. But a lot of the squatters in this Upper West Side movement made deals with the city and then left their buildings, and the city then reneged on those deals. So this is starting to develop a body of knowledge in New York City about what kinds of squatting practices are effective and what aren't. And we often hear that possession is 9/10 of the law, right? And squatters started to learn if you want to claim something and you want to get power by claiming in it, you have to hold on to it, right? You can't make a deal and then leave because all of your leverage is gone. And so coming back a little bit more to the Lower East Side, this is a picture that I actually just found today. And it has some people in it that those of you who know, particularly Lower East Side Latino history, might recognize. And this is 1973. And this is after an organization had started in this neighborhood called Adopt a Building, which was an early sweat equity homesteading project that again started, without always getting permission. And so by this point, we start to see agencies and programs and organizations developing around this practice. Operation Move-In really started as a grassroots campaign, and then big organizations like the Met Council on Housing started organizing squatting actions in response to urban renewal. And it became a tactic that was sort of part of the repertoire of even mainstream housing organizations. By 1973, an organization that some of you might know called UHAB had started. So UHAB stands for the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. They were founded out of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on the Upper West Side, the same neighborhood that had been a hotbed of squatting. And they started getting money from the city to actually run urban homesteading programs. It was also around the same time that the federal government started funding urban homesteading. And so this is an idea that is in a way radical and coming out of a squatting and direct action tradition, but that also fits really well with the ideology of the moment, right? This is people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, doing it themselves, not asking the government for help. We see a kind of individualism, a kind of entrepreneurialism that is attractive even to Republicans. So Reagan funded sweat equity and homesteading programs. And so again, I want to just point out that
Reagan defunded.
he funded them and then defunded them. I mean, he eventually defunded them, but he did allocate money, and in the early 80s.
In the early 80s?
Yeah, and there were homesteading programs that were still growing and changing, and yeah.
Sorry to...
That's okay.
By the way,
Yeah.
very, 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 very first instance of squatting was in England in 1620 when the diggers took over land,
Yeah.
which allegedly was owned by the aristocracy.
Right, so we often see squatting as a response to enclosures, right? And when we talk about enclosures, we're thinking of people taking something that's been in the public domain, that's been commonly owned and managed by people who use it and share it, and turning it into private property. And so that's what the diggers are responding to, right? They're saying, this is something that we can all share and we can all use, and it shouldn't be enclosed and privatized. So by the mid-1970s, New York City had become part of these federally sponsored homesteading programs, where the federal government would turn over houses that had been repossessed because of default on federally subsidized or federally insured mortgages, to cities who would then dispose of them by giving them to people who could renovate them and fix them up and live in them. But this is a project that doesn't have that kind of grassroots and community-based and low-income route that the early squatting and homesteading in New York City did. So the federal programs really aimed to stabilize blighted areas. They reinforced redlining, where capital wasn't allowed to come into neighborhoods that were seen to be in decline, often because of being racially mixed or predominantly people of color. They said, this is a project to stabilize neighborhoods that can still be saved. So the Lower East Side was not an area that could get federal homesteading funds. This is a program to help people who were able to get loans, who were able to work a lot on their buildings at the same time, who had a lot of resources and a lot of social capital to help them become homesteaders and to become homeowners, and to increase property values in neighborhoods and bring property back to the tax rolls, right? So this wasn't about stabilizing neighborhoods in terms of protecting them from gentrification or creating low-income housing. This is about creating property values. And so there was no caps on how much you could sell these houses for. You could get a house for free from the government, fix it up, live in it for 3 to 5 years, and then sell it at market rates. which is really different from the models that were common in New York City before that, and from the models that squatters later experienced here on the Lower East Side, where there were caps on how much you could sell the property for, and caps on how much a person who bought it could make. And the logic behind that is that poor people needed subsidies to be able to renovate their homes and bring them up to code. And I think that's both fair and unfair, right? So we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So to move ahead a little bit, all of these programs in New York City were supported by New York City's good credit. So New York City as a municipality could borrow money at low interest rates and then pass those low interest rates on to homesteaders who could use those loans to renovate their buildings. After the fiscal crisis in 1977, when New York City lost their good credit and became indebted to bankers that were able to, in many significant ways, control what the city did with their money, they weren't able to make those loans available anymore. And so homesteading started to really suffer from a lack of funding, a lack of support. At the same time, more and more properties are becoming city-owned. The city's having less and less resources to deal with them. And this crisis of vacant property is escalating at the same time as there's less resources to deal with it. So all around the country, people started squatting again to protest the limits to these homesteading programs. So in Philadelphia, Acorn, which is a community organizing nonprofit, organized people to squat vacant city and federally owned houses that were not available for homesteading, but were sitting empty because they were in these neighborhoods that weren't considered to be savable, or they weren't desirable enough for people to go in and make their homes in them. And so this is actually pretty successful. There came to be the so-called Philadelphia model of homesteading that included a lot more subsidies. But as you pointed out, Sarah, all of this is kind of gaining momentum just as Reagan comes into power and starts slashing federal funding for all kinds of housing subsidies and support, including these. So for the first couple years of Reagan's presidency, there were new homesteading programs and new homesteading funding, but it dried up pretty quickly. So in New York City, what this looked like was, for example, this campaign, which was in East New York, also led by Acorn, where people occupied dozens of buildings that were sort of owned by the city but not available for homesteading. And they had learned their lesson. They stayed in them. They didn't go out once they had started to make a deal. And the city eventually transferred all of those buildings, I think it was 27 buildings, to the people who had squatted them, along with millions of dollars of funding to renovate them, and put them in a mutual housing association. So that became the Mutual Housing Association of New York. Again, we see squatting leading to homesteading. Do people know what a mutual housing association is?
No.
So it's a structure to allow people to own property collectively but protect it from speculation. And so the Mutual Housing Association in this case owns the land that the housing is on. It's kind of like a community land trust. And so people are able to own their homes, but they're not able to sell them for a lot of money later. And there's a structure in place for people to kind of collectively make decisions about how the property should be used, how the housing should be used. Does that make sense? And so you can see, just to make my own sort of experience and biases clear, we've seen a lot of sort of black and white New York Times pictures here. And that's because my research, my sort of hands-on first-person research has really focused on squatting. And so we're going to see a little transition in a minute from black and white to color as we start to meet some of the people that I interviewed for this project. So squatters celebrate Brooklyn victory. But this did not lead to a renaissance of squatting or homesteading in New York City. In 1983, there was a request for proposals for homesteading. From the city, there were 539 inquiries for 10 to 15 possible projects. So there was still a huge demand for homesteading programs, and there was not any capacity on the part of government or nonprofits to actually make this happen, and people were getting really frustrated, including here on the Lower East Side. And so people on the Lower East Side started squatting buildings, inspired by homesteading, aiming to become homesteaders, and also challenging homesteading programs. And they brought together a really unique blend of influences that included homesteading and local Latino-led anti-displacement activism, but also hippies, yippies, DIY punk, and European squatting activism. So I want to play a little oral history here from famous Chrome, and I'll read you her bio. She was born in, and this is a picture of her from about a few years after the time that she's talking about. She was born in 1968 in Shreveport, Louisiana, from young working class parents. The family moved a lot, and Chrome ended up in college in Madison, Wisconsin, where she got involved with activism related to homelessness. After traveling around the United States and Mexico for a few years, she moved to New York City in 1993 with all of her, quote, dresses and bicycles and lovers, working on and trying to get a space in Umbrella House, then becoming landed, as she says, at 297th Street. She gave birth to a daughter there in 1995 and lost her apartment to her daughter's father after legalization started. She's an acupuncturist at the time of our interview, paid $2,300 per month for a small market rate walk-up apartment on the Lower East Side. So she's talking about Umbrella House, which is here, and then she eventually had an apartment in 209, which is here. Can you give me a sense of what your first impressions were of Umbrella, what it looked like, smelled like, felt like, sounds like?
It was 1991. Most of that whole neighborhood there were a lot of vacant lots, there were a lot of encampments. In those lots there was infrastructure there as far as like the fire hydrants for running water, there were dig-outs for people doing their dishes, for washing. It's something I engaged with a lot, all of us did, because none of these buildings had running water either in or out. We didn't have drains, no electricity, or very limited electricity that was pirated out of manholes or through lampposts, or there was a variety. The buildings, they were fairly newly occupied still, thus needed to appear still abandoned. So from the outside, they very much did look abandoned. They were completely blacked out. You couldn't see any source of light coming from inside. A lot of windows missing, a lot of disrepair, very visible. Very true on the inside also. A lot of the Umbrella House was a 6-story building, and there were stairs, but a lot of them were temporary, made out of police barricades largely, because there were a lot of police barricades around the Lower East Side at that time. And it was dark, it was cold, it was full of rubble. Some spaces had been cleared out as people were like eking out their living spaces. There were a lot of floor joists in place without floors, so you could go up 3, 4, 5 stories and see the framework for floors and where the next space should be, but you could see all the way down to the first floor. It smelled like piss most of the time because everybody used buckets, and not everybody was super great with their piss buckets. There wasn't a standard protocol, so people made a lot of that up, and some better than others. Very dusty, and also lovely, quiet, because there was no electricity in the building, which has a very different, being inside of structures without electricity feel really different than structures with electricity. A lot of the spaces for windows didn't have windows in them, so it was a lot like being outside. And at that time it was summer, and it was bright. There was vacant lots on both sides of us that were full of rubble. The building on the south side had burned, and there was still all of the burned debris there, and then just open sky, which is not the usual experience that a lot of people have, especially in Manhattan. And the building on the north side had collapsed already, and there was a back building still standing, so most of that lot was open, again, open sky, and all of the windows to the north and the south were open, just broad open space. We had set up for showering. This was actually a couple of years later after we had established a garden in the vacant lot on the north side. Had routed one of the gutters off the roof to be an open spout that came out about 10 feet from the edge of the building, and that created this like enormous waterfall when it would rain, and that was our shower. Gorgeous, really special, and also really down and out at the same time.
So I play this, rather long quote from her. So I like how you can hear her kind of going deeper and deeper into the memory as she keeps talking, and that's part of what we get from oral history, right? We let people kind of talk at length. And I want to also note that all of these interviews, for the most part, are publicly available in the Tamament archives at NYU, if you want to hear more of any of them. So, one crucial difference between squatters and homesteaders is that, while homesteaders did often take buildings without permission, especially as they started to get permission, they typically didn't live in the buildings while they were working on them. So we hear famous describing life in a building without stairs, without water, without heat, without electricity, often without a roof. And it's not just kind of living a little rough, right? It's living in a shell. It's
A little?
That's what I said. It's not just living a little rough. It's like less than camping, right? Camping in dangerous rubble.
Sorry. C-Squat in the beginning, the early 90s, they had ladders going from one floor to the other. You were drunken stone up and down those ladders? Oh boy. I did. I didn't live there, but oh boy, when it's going to visit a friend, wow, what a trip.
I heard someone describe that as being like a Hopi cliff dwelling with sort of ladders connecting all of the different levels, if that image helps you imagine it.
Like Stone Age level, I don't know, technology, whatever, I don't know how to describe it.
Right, so people often sort of malign squatters as thieves or as lazy, and I played this clip also in part to dispel some of those ideas. Later on, and I'll tell you this whole story later, when some of the squats on the Lower East Side did become legal co-ops, people who were critics of the squatters said, oh, they're getting something for free. They're getting this valuable Lower East Side real estate for free. And the amount of work that was involved is kind of unimaginable, I think, to those of us who haven't done it. So the next few clips that I'm going to play are all from people who were involved with a group of squats on 13th Street, all the way at the very top of the map here. You can see them all in a row there, 535, 537, 539, 541, 545, and across the street, 544. So those of you who've been in the neighborhood in the city for a while might remember some very dramatic and public evictions on this block in 1995-96. 544 is still there and is under construction right now and is becoming a co-op. But the 5 on the top all were evicted. And so the people that we're going to hear from are some of the people that initially opened those buildings as squats. And when they did that, they imagined themselves to be homesteaders. They started something, the East 13th Street Homesteaders Coalition. They called themselves homesteaders, and we'll hear them talking about that now. So this is David Boyle. He was born around 1960. He grew up in Queens and New Jersey, the child of a truck driver and a stay-at-home mom, and returned to New York City to attend the New School for Social Research on a Teamsters scholarship. He dropped out of college after he became involved with direct action against nuclear power, then joined the Yippies and was kicked out of the party when he applied to join the police academy.
Good.
This is a person who loves contradictions.
Good.
He got involved with homesteading and squatting on the Lower East Side in the 1980s and was a founder of the East 13th Street Homesteaders Coalition. Many people found his approach, inspired by Basque Mondragon collectives, to be too controlling and, in his own words, Stalinist. In 2013, Boyle and his wife, an architect, completed construction of their own home in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York City's first house built from recycled shipping containers, and he's pictured inside of it.
And we called it homesteading because we were emulating an existing program. and we were trying to like ride alongside and look so much like that program and describe ourselves with the same, that maybe we would, you know, it's kind of like walking backwards into the class when you're late. You know, so, oh no, I was already here. That kind of thing.
This is Marissa de Domenicis. She was one of the other people to first open those buildings. She was born in 1962. She grew up in Beacon, New York. Her parents were Italian immigrants and her background working class. She went to Emerson College and got a degree in communications before moving to New York City in 1983 and seeking to avoid an office job, becoming involved with community gardens and squats on the Lower East Side. The story that people tell is that she was in the middle of the winter trying to dig in a community garden with like a broken fork, and someone said, "You seem like you want to get involved in direct action," and she did. She was the first person to move into the squats on East 13th Street, where she lived, worked, gave birth, and raised 3 children for almost 20 years. She married another squatter, architect Paul Castrucci, and they built a green, energy self-sufficient home for their family on Rivington Street on the Lower East Side. They're now separated. She worked for the Trust for Public Land for 18 years, and at the time of our interview was the director of Earth Matter, a nonprofit promoting composting in New York City.
We applied to be in the Homesteader. I mean, the bus drivers got into a program on 545, so we were hoping that we would be candidates. It was an issue that we were living in the building. Stupid. But like, we knew all that stuff, but we couldn't lie about it.
It was stupid that it was an issue, or it was stupid to live in?
Yeah, it was stupid that it was an issue because they got work done too, but it just made more sense that, you know, every day that I got up, I'd be bringing down 4 bags of rubble. That's just what I did. I woke up and that was like my daily routine. Brush your teeth and chip away at the fallen plaster that was gonna fall on your head. We got a lot more done.
She's arguing that the fact that they live in the building shouldn't delegitimate them. In fact, it makes them a little bit more efficient. Here we'll hear Rolando Politi. I'll tell you his bio. He was born around 1944, so he's older than the rest of these folks. He's an Italian artist born at the close of World War II, who came to New York City in 1980 after years of traveling around Europe and being involved in social centers and squats there. He was a leader in and spokesperson for early Lower East Side squatting efforts, including the East 13th Street Homesteaders Coalition. By the early 1990s, Politi became disillusioned with squatting as a political project and turned his energy toward making art with recycled materials. You can see some of that here in his building. His ornate soda can pinwheels and glass bottle mosaics decorate the neighborhood squats and community gardens. Has anybody seen those?
Yes.
They may not seen those. Today, Politi lives in Bullet Space, the first squat to legalize after the 2002 deal.
Can you tell me what the buildings were like, actually, when you first moved into them? Describe the physical condition, or what they felt like, what they smelled like, sounded like.
Yeah, well, yeah, pretty horrible, you know, talk about the smells, kind of dead animals, that kind of nauseating smell of a lot of, is in English that word, mold and mildew, a lot of that, also excrements, dried up ones, some not so dried up ones, which is not bad when they're liquid. Like in the basement, in one building, there was a lot of shit taken out from the sewage area, but broken pipe. I remember going there with boots, big boots, but that not so bad, the smell, as long as there's water, humidity. It's kind of musty, you know, subterranean smell, kind of like Third Man from the movie in Vietnam, where they goes runs through sewage. On the higher upper floors, much nicer, of course, just more closer to the air. Pigeons coming in, you know, freely. Talk about freedom again. Also, the pigeons had great freedom in those days. They were going in and out, open windows, open roofs. yeah, apocalyptic, but also very interesting and free at the same time. You know, liberating. I mean, liberating. That's a good word. Like, and inviting you to like, okay, let's get started. You know, and yet where do we start? Which, but a nice feeling to it because. Well, because there's nobody stopping you from doing whatever you want, you know, to do within, you know, the collaborative situation.
So we hear that same sense of both challenging and beautiful vacant spaces that we heard from Famous. We also hear a little bit of sort of a frontier language, right? That this is empty, it's free, there's no one stopping you, almost like there's nobody there, right? And so it is true that a lot of people coming to this neighborhood from outside imagined it to be vacant. You know, you see pictures of just acres of empty lots strewn with rubble. Of course, it was full of people, full of life, full of activity, full of an incredibly vibrant political and cultural scene. And the interactions between people who came from outside and people who already were here range from collaboration to guerrilla warfare. And we'll hear Rolando tell us a little bit more about that. He was sort of the spokesperson at the community board.
There was the homesteading program at the time, and so our scope was really to link up with the homestead and get the building in that program and eventually work ourselves with the sweat equity and live happily there ever after. So the plan was 5 years. The main difference was, and we soon found that out, was that they were not going in the building, they were working in the building on weekends, collecting sweat equity credits, and so, you know, month after month, they kept cleaning the building, but the other work was done eventually by contractors, but they didn't have problems with the city, they were not considered squatters, the homesteading program. Well, we played that homesteading program quite a bit in protection of ourselves. And we're homesteaders also. Just that, you know, it's too far to go back home at night. So I might as well sleep here, you know, so that tomorrow morning I can work again. Things like that.
You hear him talking about sweat equity credits. And part of what I'm interested in the larger project is why the history of squatting in this neighborhood is so well documented, why people care so much about this history, why people who were involved with this activism were so careful about documenting what they did. And a lot of it has to do with this sense of trying to make a case for how much work has been done. You know, these stories about how raw and rough the buildings were when they first entered them are serving that purpose of saying, look at everything we've achieved. But a lot of the sort of foundational historical documents that allow us to understand this story come from, you know, sweat equity work logs, from minutes from meetings, from collections of receipts that people collected in the service of trying to eventually make more legal claims in the building. So Rolando talks about going to the community board, getting approval for their project. Not that the community board can give them a building, but then taking this paper and sort of putting it up on the wall and saying to anyone who comes by, no, look, we're approved, right? Like if the police come or HPD, the city housing agency comes, the community board says this is okay. We're part of this homesteading thing, even if we're not legal homesteaders. But there are plenty of people who did not agree with that.
So the main point was community renewal and keep the housing stabilized. And that went on very well, at least with the community board, and the local politics were overwhelmingly liberal, democratic on the Puerto Rican side, the minority, so to speak, side, which was here the majority at the time. But the conservative elements was the one who would criticize us, and now in hindsight and with my 2020 vision, they had equally a good point by saying, are you like for real of what you present, or are you just putting up a front and what you're saying is not really correct, and you have people who are not from this community, and eventually you might end up even destroying the building, which is a resource, and if you don't know what you're doing, the building might just end up in fire, so you'll be better off not being there, and we can save it for the community by sealing it up. That's the conservative side. And we had really interesting battles between them and us at the time.
So, homesteading started at a time when it seemed like there was no demand for this housing, right? That if someone took it and fixed it up, the other alternative was that it would just fall down and go to waste. By the time they were taking these buildings on 13th Street, the buildings were starting to become valuable. And it was much harder to make an argument that it was right to just take them and use them. And so you hear Rolando here kind of trying to articulate that, and saying that, the people who argued against him had a valid point too. And so he's talking about a period in the mid-1980s in this neighborhood where a group of people had organized and pressured the city to actually put a moratorium on selling and developing city-owned vacant buildings. There were a couple hundred left at that point. And it seemed like what happened to those buildings would really decide the fate of the neighborhood. Is this going to become just an upper middle class and upper class totally gentrified neighborhood, or are working class people and people of color going to have the capacity to stay? And so during this moratorium, squatters kept taking buildings, and they held on to them. And when a deal was eventually made called the 50-50 cross-subsidy plan, which was sort of an early public-private partnership model of developing housing, where half of the buildings would become market rate housing, the profits from selling those to developers would go to subsidize the rest of them being turned into low-income housing, and that didn't actually work out the way it was supposed to, but that was ostensibly the deal. The squatters' buildings were counted as part of that, so they could be disposed of to for-profit, not for-profit. And that's actually what happened to the East 13th Street buildings. They were put in the pool of not-for-profit development buildings and sold that way.
It's the double cross subsidy plan.
The double cross subsidy plan. And so that's a point where squatters who were holding on to buildings that became, I think, to a higher degree marginalized from mainstream housing activism in the neighborhood, because most of the housing organizations had kind of come together and agreed to this plan. Squatters hadn't agreed to it, and they were sort of left out and left in some ways to defend themselves a little bit more on their own. So we're going to hear just a few more little quotes, and then I'll open it up for some discussion. This is Howard Brandstein. He was born in 1953. He grew up middle class in Washington Heights, a neighborhood in northern Manhattan. He attended Stony Brook University, where he did a senior thesis on urban homesteading, and spent time in several major cities on the East Coast researching homesteading and urban development. So this is a guy that really cares about homesteading. In March of 1978, he began homesteading himself and worked as an organizer for the Adopt a Building program. From there, worked with a variety of other housing organizations. He's lived in a contentiously governed homesteaded building on the Lower East Side since 1981 and runs the 6th Street Community Center. Can you tell me a little bit about what the relationship was like between squatters and homesteaders in this neighborhood during the
Well,
time?
early on, it was very supportive. Like, we came out, supported the 7th Street squatters, and because seemed like they were authentic, people from the community, some people who weren't, but they shared a similar philosophy, not for profit. At a certain point, it became contentious because we were competing for some of the same buildings, and there was a feeling that squatters were not reaching out enough to people in the community, but especially the Latino population. And because the squatters would move into the building and they would renovate it while they're living there, in the beginning at least, it was not conducive to bring in families. There was no electric, no utilities. In the homesteading, we weren't moving in. So we were able to develop a broader conception of participation. In the final analysis, I guess there's probably a lot to say about it. Probably more political energy has come out of the squatting movement in recent years, I think some of the homesteads have fallen into, land, that more conservative ethic. As people get their buildings legitimized, they become, they lose some of that idealism and energy. So you see that happening in both efforts.
Let's hear one more from David Boyle.
We made up the signs, this land is ours, not for sale, because they were modeled on, HPD had put signs on their buildings, the HPD, blah, 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 blah. So we made a very close replica of their signs by taking the sheet metal that was used on the windows of the abandoned building put up by HPD, cutting it down to the right size in our shop, our storefront, making the stencils, and working together with other homesteads that were more formalized than we were. And then this process of the community board, we got them to come up with, they made a form that you would check out for getting approval from the community board, and you had to put all your members, and it was starting to shape up to be a ground up process that looked great. And then we got a couple of the kind of punk squatter buildings, and then didn't go for that process, didn't like what we were doing, disrupted the community board meetings. Not going before them, but not only that, actually going in and making the meeting impossible to carry on. Right at the time, we were very close, I thought, to getting this kind of process going. And then you couldn't even get to a community board meeting after that. There was no process from that point on. And that was the intention of the anarchist element, to take a regularization of what we called homesteading and to make an openly hostile environment that was called squatting, and had no intention of any interaction with the government. It was entirely provisional and was not about permanent housing.
So we hear David articulating a good squatter, bad squatter dichotomy, right? Where the good squatters are aiming to become homesteaders, working with the community board, and there's these bad anarchist punk squatters who are disrupting this process and sort of ruining it for everyone. And I would argue that people who self-identify as anarchists in this community are probably among the most organized, and that the influence of DIY punk on the squatting scene was not, for the most part, one of sort of chaos and disruption, but again, a structure for helping people to organize themselves to take care of and live in these buildings together. But it is true that unlike homesteaders, squatters were very decentralized, and people were coming to it for a really broad range of different reasons. There were people in this movement, many of them, maybe most of them, that were doing this because they wanted to own these buildings. They wanted to produce low-income housing. They wanted to build a long-term place to live for themselves and for people after them and for their families. But there were also people for whom that was not a goal and who explicitly opposed that. There were people who were doing this to challenge private property. And so that made it very hard for squatters to come together with a unified voice in the way that homesteaders could. We sort of had all, at least on paper, agreed to these ground rules when they were occupying their buildings.
Now, what he didn't mention is the reason we marched on a community board was to shut it down. Why did we shut it down? Because they would rubber stamp the scumlords and the real estate interests and evicting the squats. That's
Right.
why.
So it's a sort of an age-old debate of, are you going to get what you want by trying to work with the power structures that exist, or are there, very real limits to what you can achieve that way? And so the community board may have been able to support some squatting initiatives in some ways, but yeah, there were certainly
Most of the time it's
limits.
not.
And as you can hear from all of these, there were very real tensions in the neighborhood about who had the right to these buildings and what was the right way to claim and deal with them. So this is a picture of an eviction watch list. It's like a phone tree. Squatters, even in the face of all of this decentralization, which one could also argue is a strength, these competing motives, were able to organize themselves very effectively to hold on to many of these buildings for a long time. They used tactics from phone trees to blockades, barricades, booby traps, and they were able to resist many attempts, although not all, to evict them.
Year-old aged this in compound buckets that we opened up and threw on the cops.
Yeah, famously.
And
So
then
those
shit
smelly
also.
piss buckets become a weapon.
Watch them puke their guts out. It's fun.
There's a lot of piss and shit in these stories. So when squatters were evicted, it was expensive, it was embarrassing for the city. They were able to still make successful claims that they had a right to these buildings because of their hard work, because they were more diverse than the sort of entirely white, out-of-town way that they were portrayed in the media, because there were families in the buildings. And so after all of this conflict, to many people's shock and surprise, in 2002, a deal was announced between the city and UHAB, the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board that we heard about starting in the early 1970s on the Upper West Side, and 11 of the remaining squats on the Lower East Side to legalize. So the deal was that those buildings would be transferred to UHAB for $1 each. UHAB would take out loans on the squatters' behalf to renovate the buildings and bring them up to code with the assistance of sweat equity labor from the people who were living in them. When the buildings were legally occupiable, they would be transferred to the people living in them at that time and become limited equity low income co-ops. So this is not a model where they become entirely privatized and revert to the market. They're somewhat protected from the market. So there are caps on how much a person can make who buys an apartment in the buildings, and caps on how much apartments can be sold for. And the negotiation of those caps, as you can imagine, was difficult and contentious. And here's a classic from the New York Post example of the kind of portrayal that squatters are arguing against when they tell their stories of hard work. So I'm going to actually skip Aaron. Yeah, because I want to give you some time for discussion. So this is Jeff Jan. He lives in Umbrella House. He lived. He was born around 1967 near Madison, Wisconsin, like famous. Grew up in a middle-class family. He was a punk rock teenager who loved skateboarding. Moved to San Francisco to be in a band when he was 23. In 1989, he moved to New York City and into Umbrella House. He's the father of a young daughter, loves to surf in the Rockaways, and works full-time doing construction. In 2014, he was planning to sell his apartment in Umbrella House and move to Maine, and he didn't. So let's hear his take on the legalization deal.
Decriminalization.
The city, I think, was forced, to make this, create this program, especially for us. They were probably just like, what are we going to do with these people? They won't leave. They're not going to buy the buildings. They're not going to just someday show up and say, here's $1 million, we'd like to purchase our building. So they created this thing where they could, in a way it seems cool, but at the same time, I think the way they set it up for us is they're kind of like trying to set us up for failure, or at least weed out the bad seeds, and get rid of the bad apples and only keep the real responsible ones who can work and make money and give them money, pay taxes. I think that's what they did. It might be a big trick, who knows? Because the way I see it, we were all just a bunch of squatters, and we didn't want those responsibilities to begin with. So how are they going to turn squatters into responsible citizens? Can they? That's like a social studies experiment. that could be studied for the next thousands of years in colleges all over the world. How they turned a bunch of squatters into responsible citizens, tax-paying citizens. Yes, a few of them ended up in jail, but for the most part, we were able to break them too.
So we hear again these questions of who deserves housing, right? Is it only people who work hard, who can produce money on a regular basis? How do we decide who gets to make claims on a neighborhood, who belongs? We'll hear from two more people. This is Nigel Clayton. Used to live across the street from here. He was born in 1968 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He was raised in a family of school teachers. He started working in a record store when he was 13. At age 20, hitchhiked to New York City to break into the music industry. Even though he immediately became homeless, he found a home of sorts among the artists and musicians on the Lower East Side. He got connected with squatters such as Jerry the Peddler and Adam Purple by hanging out in Tompkins Square Park, crashed in many buildings, and eventually landed a spot in Dos Locos, a racially mixed building that he remembered as a multicultural utopia. When that was evicted in 1999, he moved to Serenity House, where he lived as one of the few people of color in a predominantly white building. He works as a DJ and is staff for music events.
It's been 2 years and all I get is screw you. You know, this is our building, we'll do what we want to it. You either pay us or you get out. We don't care that you lived here for 15 years before us ever coming here. We don't care that you were able to make a go of it before us ever coming here. We are the new owners. We are the landlord. We decide what goes on in this apartment. We decide what the apartment looks like. Your history, none of that means nothing. Pay us or get out. So in that, no. I think that the U-Hab thing is just, I was better off as a squatter. I was way better off as a squatter paying house dues. My electrical account was straight.
So we hear real anger in his voice, right? He's not happy with this outcome. His building is one of the ones that was got renovated, and here's the outside of it. And it's a generic New York City renovated tenement. We've all seen them. You can tell here how important the history is. I started off talking about how we make things our own when we mix our labor with them. He had built a space that was part of him, or had inhabited a space that became part of how he could exist in the world. And when he came back, he felt like this wasn't a place that he could be anymore. He wasn't able to pay the rent. He wasn't able to get along with his neighbors to induce them to help him or save him, and he lost the apartment eventually. The last person we're going to hear from is Maggie Wrigley. She was born in 1958 in Brisbane, Australia, which you'll hear in her voice. She grew up in Sydney. Her father was a chemist, her mother was a teacher. After briefly attending art school, she left Australia to go traveling and stayed in San Francisco for a year, living in a punk rock warehouse and working in a punk rock club. She intended to only visit New York City for a while in 1984, but felt instantly at home and has lived here and worked in nightclubs ever since. She came to Bullet Space, a small building with an art gallery on the ground floor, in the winter of 1987, when she and her boyfriend were about to become homeless. She still lives there today, although the boyfriend is long gone. She recently edited a book on radical communal architecture, The Architecture of Change, Building a Better World, now out in paperback, and is working on a book about her experiences squatting.
We were accused of everything, speculation, trying to steal these buildings, of profiteering, of wanting, just to steal stuff and get over, and, all from out of town, and nobody was local, nobody had any commitment to the neighborhood, And that's the beautiful thing about where we are today, is because we can say that we are the only people that came out of this entire history that actually meant what we said. And we said it was about affordable housing. These buildings will always be affordable housing. And, and that's everybody that fought so hard against us, all these non-profit groups, they're flipped, their buildings flipped, they're all market rate now, so it's like all those, we really, I'm really proud, we proved that what we were doing was what we said and what we did was one and the same, and you know, it's took a long time to be able to say that we proved it, but you know, it's a fantastic thing. It's like a gift to the neighborhood.
So we hear a vindication here. What she's talking about is the 50-50 cross-subsidy plan in large part. That all of the people that criticized the squatters as not serious, as not from here, as not committed, were proved wrong when this eventually became permanent, low-income, affordable housing. And so we see that you know, some squatters wanted to be homesteaders and eventually became homesteaders in you know, most meaningful ways. They joined a program that looked a lot like the programs that homesteaders had access to in the 70s, 80s, and a little bit in the 90s. And there were some people who were not able to be incorporated into the system or didn't want to be. Some of those people left. Some were pushed out, some are still in the neighborhood, and some are gone. So I think squatters over time have instigated and provided the impetus for homesteading movements. And they've also been the foil for homesteaders, right? So the bad, wild, ungovernable squatters make the homesteaders look good and palatable, and make it easier to give them resources. So the sort of easy dichotomy between the law-abiding homesteaders and the wild and ungovernable squatters is shown to be more of maybe, you know, we could say for those of us who like Marxism, a dialectic. So I just put up a couple of the sources that I find useful in understanding this, besides obviously just talking to people who have lived through it. There's so many people that I talked to that we didn't hear from tonight, and so many people that I didn't talk to, more people that I didn't talk to than that I did. And the version of this story that I understand is, of course, partial and incomplete, and is, you know, my best attempt to make sense of all of this. So I would love to hear your thoughts. I know we do have a lot of people in the room who've lived through this, and I would really like for them to be able to share their experiences and their thoughts as well.